But when you give dignity to the people that you're living with and that you're around, you're a part of that story, but they're also an equal part of that story. And it's saying this is an experience with multiple people, and we're all a part of this. And the center of it is God. This is what God is doing, and this is what God is teaching me, and this is how I'm seeing God work in their lives, and this is what I see God doing in all of us. And so I think just that little bitty shift in focus of saying, they are image bearers, and they deserve that dignity that comes with that. It just really it helps shift that perspective of why am I communicating? What am I communicating about in a more positive, God-centered way?
Yeah.
Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you. All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. Heather and Andy here with you today, and we're actually going to have another episode on communication. So communication with your partners is arguably one of the foundational elements of support-based work. We think it's an important element to do well and an important skill to develop. So what does it look like to share stories about your ministry without making the people you work with look like a project? In contrast to our current media streams, which seem to highlight problems or the negative, we want to be people that draw attention to those that we serve as fellow image bearers. We are all made in God's image. It is a privilege to open a window for your partners and shape their perspective on a culture that most people will never interact with. So how can we tell their story truly, holistically, and with dignity? And to help us today, Andy, tell us more about our guest.
Yeah, so privileged to have, air quotes, Clyde with us today. We are using a pseudonym again, just based on where he works. So he has been in Southeast Asia now for 11 years. From Alabama originally, graduated from Union University, and now has 2 additional MAs, one from University of Mississippi, one from Wheaton. He is one of my favorite accounts to follow on social media. And
Mine too.
I think that when you see what he posts, it's clear that storytelling and this medium is really foundational to how he connects with people back home and how he explains how he lives as well and how he demonstrates that and illustrates that. So Clyde, we'd love to hear a bit of your story. You can take it however you want, fill in the gaps, but what led you into support-based work?
Yeah, well, thank you guys, first of all, for super kind comments. That's really encouraging, and kind of keeps me motivated to continue sharing
Great.
those stories. Honestly, what led me into this was God plopping this new life in the middle of my lap, or in the middle of school. I was in the middle of a degree, of that degree at the University of Mississippi, and had no idea this was coming. It was never on my horizon. Going overseas, working in support-based work. And God just showed up out of nowhere, kind of in a moment of reflection, and asking him, if there was any changes in my life that I needed to make. And he came through and said, yeah, there's a couple of changes and a lot of big changes. And this is one of the big changes, obviously, is that the direction of my work was going to be drastically different than I ever thought it would be. And so, in the middle of a grad program, studying history, that turned into going overseas on the other side of the world to Southeast Asia. And that's been home now for the last many number of years.
So I'm curious, over the years, have you developed any guiding principles on how you communicate about your host culture and its people? And if so, how'd you get there? How'd you arrive at those?
I ask myself questions all the time when I'm getting ready to share a story. I ask myself kind of these guiding principles, these questions. And kind of the first set of questions is always, what do I love about my host culture? What gets me excited? What kind of draws on my heartstrings about the culture that I get to call my home now? and what has made me reflect on my culture as well. And so these are just questions that I'm asking myself. And I think I start with those questions because I want to share out of my own experience. I want to share over what I'm living.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is my life in this host culture, and this is what I'm going through. And these are the things that I'm experiencing. And I want to do that because I want to be authentic. I want to be real in the fact that this is what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also trying to. I know that if I am sharing out of what causes me joy and what causes me, or what gives me joy, what gives me hope, and what makes me excited, and the things that I love, I know that if I'm sharing stories from that place, then that will bring in the listeners into that feeling as well. And so I want to focus on those positive experiences. Not to say that negative things don't happen,
Sure.
but out of excitement, I feel like stories shared out of excitement and stories shared out of love are always going to be more effective and more authentic, because that's these are real feelings, these are real emotions, these are real stories, and so I want to focus on those. The other guiding principle on how I communicate is this idea that you guys have already mentioned, that we are all image bearers. And something that I believe fully is that the diversity and beauty that we see in all these cultures across the world, and how they're different and how they're beautiful in different ways, and how they're so interesting and deep and complex, and how that's expressed differently in different cultures. I think that really comes down to the fact that God's image in us as cultures, we can only contain so much. We can only display so much of God's bigness and his beauty. And so it has to be expressed across the world in different ways to get this fuller picture of his image. And so, when I'm in my host culture, I'm trying to think through, how do I see God's image in this culture differently from where I came, and how can I highlight that? And that kind of goes back to like what brings me joy, what brings me hope, and what gets me excited when I look at the host culture that I'm in, is that the things that bring me joy and bring me excitement are these areas that I feel like I see God differently. I see a different part of his image in the host culture that I'm in. And so I want to bring that out. I want to talk about that because I have been encouraged so much by experiencing my host culture in that way. And I want the people back in my support community to experience it through my stories. And so those are kind of how I approach sharing and communicating about my host culture.
That's great. I mean, it's just, when you think about it, it's crazy to assume that our home culture is able to hold the fullness of his image. It's really just a splinter, right? Of his magnitude. Yeah, that's great. That's a good takeaway for me.
Yeah, I really love that perspective. I think that's really meaningful. So I'm currently reading a book actually that's centered on dignity. It's actually called The Dignity Revolution, written by Daniel Darling. And I'm not that far in, but I was really struck by something that I read the other day. One thought that the author shared was, if our generation would leave a legacy that our spiritual grandchildren will be proud of, and that the world may one day be thankful for, we must learn what it means to really live out what we say we believe, that every person we meet, interact with, or hear of carries inalienable dignity, made as they are in God's image. Without this, we will have incomplete tools for loving our neighbor and carrying out the mission of God. I just really felt like it was so impactful to think on how important our ministry is, on the degree to which we are operating as image bearers ourselves and regarding others as image bearers.
That's so critical. I feel like we don't get enough of that. It's easy to get distracted, especially if you're just consuming the default media that is presented to you. That's pretty divisive, actually, and pretty dehumanizing, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Clyde, I guess I would ask you, what do you think is at stake by not focusing on dignity when you talk about your ministry?
I think there's always the tendency for us to look at our ministry as a project.
Mm-hmm.
and to look at it as, this is a thing that I am doing rather than a life that I am living alongside other people who are living their lives. And, I always go back to the fact that God loved these people before I was ever in the picture.
Mm.
And he loves them now more than I ever will. And he will
Right.
continue to love them after I'm gone. And so for me to look at them as a project, as a thing that I'm doing, to me it feels like, well, it puts me at the center of it. And I think,
Mm.
what you said, there's a lot of negativity, there's a lot of divisiveness. And really, when you look at it, negativity and divisiveness always kind of seems to channel the communication back to me and
Mm.
what I think and how I think you might be wrong, or how I think, it just kind of naturally finds its way back to me. But when you give dignity to the people that you're living with and that you're around, it kind of, you're a part of that story, but they're also an equal part of that story. And it's saying this is an experience with multiple people, and we're all a part of this. And the center of it is God. This is what God is doing, and this is what God is teaching me, and this is how I'm seeing God work in their lives, and this is what I see God doing in all of us. And so I think just that little bitty shift in focus of saying, they are image bearers, and they deserve that dignity that comes with that. It just really it helps shift that perspective of why am I communicating? What am I communicating about? I don't know, just in a more positive, God-centered way
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah, that's great. I think that comes across very clearly in a lot of your communication,
Mm-hmm.
that you have a deep love and care for the people that you're living amongst. But I'm also struck by the fact that these people are so much more precious to God than they are to you.
Mm-hmm.
Even still.
Yeah.
Right? There's no way we can approach that.
Yeah. And that extends beyond the people that you might be, quote unquote, serving, right? That extends to the people that are on your team or that do your taxes or, whatever. I think that this value of regarding people as image bearers and treating them with dignity, really, it bears on all of our communication and the way we represent everybody, not just those that we're ministering to, right? We're talking about this playing out in an overseas context, in a home culture where it's now your home, but it's not your home culture that you've come from. I am aware that for those, workers that are living and working within their home culture, how this kind of might seem even more difficult to manage, right? Like here in North America, let's say somebody that is living and working in campus ministry, I can imagine that it's really difficult and feels very countercultural for them to speak with dignity about the college students that they are ministering to, when our culture has a very different refrain around what it looks like to be this generation or to be in college, or you know what I'm saying? I think that there's a lot of value in just applying dignity.
It can be very tempting to focus on the objectives that you're trying to accomplish rather than the people. But I think, to use the word objectify, we use that in a lot of different contexts, but you're essentially doing the same thing. You're objectifying these people and not seeing them for who they are. Yeah.
I think, I often tell people that the way that I came about being in Southeast Asia, and I alluded to it at the beginning about how it just kind of seemed to come out of nowhere. That was actually a huge blessing in so many ways. But one of the ways is I had no prior background knowledge, experience, or even awareness of where I was going before I was basically signed up to go. And so one of the initial prayers that I had was, okay, God, you want me to go to this country that honestly I didn't even know existed in any real way. So you've got to give me a love for them because I have nothing to pull on. And he answered that. And that was one of the kind of the first, I don't know, one of the first ways that God really shook up my world is because he answered that he answered that prayer in such a real way. And
Mm.
in the sense that all of a sudden I had this overwhelming love for these people.
Mm.
And
Mm.
I could never claim that love. It was never anything that I couldn't point to me and say, oh yeah, like I've always loved them and they've always been on my heart. Not saying that that's a bad way to approach stuff, but it was always, God, this is your love for this people expressed in my little heart. So all of that to say, I would agree completely that in a North American context where you have all this background experience and knowledge and possibly biases and all these things that are now crowding out your attention, your heart attention for it. That is, I mean, I struggle with that. I struggle with loving people in my passport country because there are so many extra things that want to crowd out my perspective. And one of the kind of consequences of living in my new home for so many years is now I do have some experiences and I do have some biases, and I have to sometimes keep those in check to not really crowd out that initial love that I feel that God gave me. And so it is definitely a challenge to not to remember the dignity of those people, to not objectify them, especially when you've got this whole world of distractions that are really trying to crowd out that dignity,
or not slip back into our tribalism.
Right?
I love that prayer, Lord, give me an overwhelming love for these people. And I think like the Lord loves to answer prayers that are in alliance, that are aligned with his will.
Yeah.
And this seems like dead center. Like, so,
oh yeah.
So listener, if you're thinking about going somewhere, or if you're in the first year, you're just still struggling with that, like, what a great prayer.
Yeah. Well, and do you remember when we talked with PG about spiritual warfare? That was one of the first things he talked about, was a story of a lot of frustration on team and just praying like, Lord, help me love this team.
Yeah. It's great. Okay. So Clyde, to give folks an example practically of why we're talking about this, can you think of a time when you've seen this done poorly?
I'm not necessarily thinking of a specific example, but there's this category of return presentations, right? Where, you might have a group from a church going overseas somewhere, and they have this 1 week experience, and they come back and they're sharing about it. And the longer that I am overseas and the longer that I'm in this world of support raising and all of this stuff, I become less and less comfortable in those kind of presentations. When I come back to the North America and I'm sitting in a church and I'm watching another group kind of, maybe it's the youth group or and this is not to pass judgment on them. This is not to, I don't want to come across as the grumpy old person in the back of the church, but what I see is slideshow presentations or videos where, the images, the stories, it is all about, this is what I did. This is how I feel. This is, and in the pictures, it's always, or in the videos, the pictures and the videos, it's always the world created around the foreigner. It's always, it's either explicit or implied. Like this is this country around me. And so it's like the way that they talk about like, oh, this was weird, or this was strange. And they use these words of just like, oh, this was just like, it drove me crazy. And I can't believe they did it like this. And, and they're trying to share it in this sense of like, oh, this is the fun part of my storytelling. And then they move into the more heartfelt things. And it was, this is how, I don't know. It's just, it just seems like it's very foreign worker focused. And it's just, it's, I get the pressure is there to talk about, there are people who gave the money to go on those trips and they want to really reflect how that money impacted their life. But it just, sometimes it feels like it slides into again, it's centering on the person, the foreigner who's gone over. And so that's kind of poor examples of that.
Yeah, they're tempted to report on, here's how the Lord worked through me or through us.
Yeah.
Versus like, here's what the Lord did and showed me through this people.
Mm.
And here's how he changed me. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think another element that I've seen in, presentations or opportunities of that sort is just maybe an overemphasis on the brokenness of a culture without holding it in tension with the ways that culture might manifest a unique aspect of God's beauty or character that our own does not. I think that holding that tension is really important in, really forming an idea about a culture in someone's mind.
And it's hard to assume things, but why do you think we're tempted to do this? What would you say is at the heart of this type of communication?
Yeah. I mean, I think it just kind of comes down to the fact that we all have a prideful part of our heart that wants to talk about us.
Yeah.
And that's me. That's most people that I know that have been honest enough to share about it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's just part of sinful humanity. And it's nothing to be, well, it's something to be aware of, not necessarily condemning of ourselves, because, Jesus Jesus said, I see you who you are and I still love you. And so obviously, we can grow from that. But I think it just comes down to that prideful self view of, this is my experience. And, and Andy, you were talking about how this is what God taught me, and this is what, God did through me. I think the very simple thing that you can change your perspective and then your communication is to say, this is how I joined what God was doing there already. This is how, this is how he invited me to be a part of his work, right? Because again, it's you are a part of the story. So this is not saying you can never mention yourself.
Sure.
You are a part of that story, but recognizing that, it's God's story that he invited you in, and he's been writing this story and he will continue to write it. And thankfully you get to have a chapter, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
But just recognizing who's the author. I'm not the author. He is.
And realizing that we're side characters. We aren't the protagonists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Clyde, have you always approached communication this way, or have you experienced some change? Have you experienced some growth? What fueled this awareness, or maybe a shift towards communicating this way?
Yeah. No, I definitely I am as guilty as anybody. I've had to learn through sometimes painful lessons of recognizing what was happening. And I honestly, my first year was foundational in kind of this switch, because I went overseas and I had this pressure. I felt this pressure of, people have given me money to have stories. And that's kind of how I viewed it.
Yeah.
And my first year was, okay, let me get some stories. Because when I go back to North America the next summer, the people who gave me money are going to say, so what happened?
Right.
So I had this pressure, and there was the beginning of a story with one of my dear friends where it looked like it was going to be a salvation story. And I remember just feeling the excitement building as each week and month went on, because it was getting near to when I would be returning to North America. And I just remember, this is it. This is the dramatic movie moment. There's these build up orchestra in the background. And there's going to be a salvation decision.
Fanfare.
Just a few. Exactly. And I had it perfectly in my mind. And in my mind, I was excited about the fact that this guy was looking like he was going to make a decision to follow Christ. But I was probably equally, if not more excited, if I'm honest, about the fact that this is a home run story that I can tell. And a few weeks before I was getting ready to depart to come back to North America, it completely, it turned a 180. There was no conclusion to the story. He did not make a decision. And in fact, he stopped talking to me, and there was silence in the conversations.
Wow.
To the point where I thought I had done something wrong. And so I went back that summer and feeling so defeated and feeling so lost at the fact that I don't have this story. what am I going to say to people? What about all of these expectations? And God really spoke through my prayers of lament over this issue. He said, "No, you're lamenting about the wrong thing. Like you should yearn to see him come to know me, but that's not why you should be. That's the only reason you should feel this burden. All of this other burden, the question that he asked me in my prayers was, why are you sad that I haven't done what only I can do yet?
Mm.
Um, and it was just a very simple realization of, oh, this is not my story. I'm not the one who gets to dictate when things happen. And
Yes.
so that kind of started that process in my mind of thinking through things differently, for sure. And so that first year was definitely foundational in kind of my journey of telling stories and looking at them
Yeah.
differently.
That's so tricky because I feel like one of the main things what people need to know before they go on the field is things take time,
Mm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it sounded like, I'm kind of interpreting here, but it sounded like you felt like having this story of success, of life change will legitimize your presence there and
Exactly.
justify those donations.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for sure, there was a fear of, well, if I don't have this story, then year two is not going to happen,
Mm.
because people are going to ask, well, why did I give you money for your first year? And so it was very much centered on, it was for sure me trying to legitimize their support.
Yeah.
Um, I'm trying to bring about something that was never in my power to bring about anyway.
Right. What's my ROI?
Well,
Exactly.
I'm reminded of a conversation we recently had in another recap where our guest was just saying that, churches have a personality too, and that a lot of churches want to hear the victory stories.
Right.
That's very much part of our cultural expectation. So yeah, that's very interesting. But something that strikes me about what you're saying, Clyde, is it's almost a shift from feeling like you need to find stories to kind of settling into just being a herald to tell stories. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great kind of, that role switch definitely feels much better.
And actually on those lines, so I remember recently reading a story you posted on social media about, I think you called her your local mom, and how she approached some of the worst events that happened in and to her country. You'll tell it better than me. Would you mind recounting that story for us?
Yeah, for sure. So just with some background, there is a very intense and dark connection between my passport country and the country that I now call home. A dark background of military conflict. Yeah, so that's the background to this. And so so there's a family in my new home country that has just basically adopted me, and I would say that the mother of that family is kind of the heart, the beating heart of that family, and she has from the very beginning loved me as her son, and I have loved her as a mom. And it's one of the more beautiful examples that I've been given of how love can overcome so many boundaries if it is allowed to flow on its course, without us putting these boundaries up. And so anyway, I spent a lot of time with this family and got to know them really well over the years. And so I remember specifically there was a time where I was visiting with them, and we were just hanging out, and she kind of pulled me off to the side and she said, "Claude, I would love to share some things with you." And she sat me down and she started telling me about how when she was a teenager, and she told me, she said, I know the history between your country and my country, and I want you to know that when I was growing up, I remember what happened to my country because of your country. And she was giving me details about how she could recognize the sound of planes, of warplanes, that would come and bomb the area around her village. And she recounted about how she would recognize the hum of a plane, and it would immediately just bring out this fear of, is that a plane coming to bomb? Is it just a plane flying overhead? And if it got louder and louder, her family had a specified place to run to, a ditch next to the road where they would hide. And, she just continued to recount her feelings and her experiences about how, just complete fear of, is this plane going to drop a bomb on my village, or is it going to be the village over from mine, or is it just flying over to bomb somewhere else in the countryside? And sometimes it would bomb her village, and they would have to huddle together, and sometimes it would fly over, but there was just always this fear.
Yeah.
And so she's telling me, she's recounting this story, and my reaction, my initial reaction was to start to apologize, just to say, I'm so sorry that this happened between our countries, and that I come from this country that was such a dark part of your childhood. And as I'm in the middle of apologizing, she stopped me and she said, no, Clyde, this is not why I'm telling you this story. I'm not telling you this story because I want you to apologize to me. I'm telling you this story to tell you that I love you so much in spite of what happened. And, she talked about how he could hold on to anger and bitterness towards me and towards, my home country because of what happened. But what good would that do? She said, what good does it bring me by holding on to that? She told me that it's so much better to choose to love, to choose to forgive. And specifically, she wanted me to know that she saw that I was there in her country to love, and therefore it was reciprocal. She was loving me, and I was loving her. And it was this beautiful picture of saying, it doesn't matter what's happening in the past. It doesn't matter what our different nationalities represent and our backgrounds, all those things that come with that we can choose to let those go if we want to, and we can choose to love instead. And so just really being humbled myself, and just seeing this woman with so much maturity and so much wisdom, and really challenging me to say, where could I love more freely, and where could I let go of past hurts and past angers? And it was a really beautiful reminder that, I went to that country initially with the mindset of, what can I teach them, or what can I do for them? And just time after time, it has been, wow, this is what they're teaching me, and this is what I'm getting from them. That's kind of been the consistent thing that's happened over the years, is seeing that in them and how they're teaching me things.
Yeah. That's humbling for those of us who come from this background to think, oh, I'm coming here to bring truth, and I'm bringing ethics and morality, and like, wow, that's miles above where many of us are. The maturity,
that level of forgiveness, long suffering.
That is not easy. I mean, we've talked about living with anxiety before too in this podcast, and talk about living in constant fear and anxiety of, like, is that plane going to bomb me right now? Yeah. Do you have other examples? I'm curious, like, of how your host culture has demonstrated, like, maturity, civility, dignity, things that the way that they've stretched you and grown you.
I think about, as a general rule, my host culture values hospitality and generosity in ways that just completely blow me away sometimes. To the point where, you go and visit a family that is clearly materialistically has less than what I would be used to seeing, in my home culture, which then makes me feel that, oh my goodness, they're in need of so much, right?
Yeah.
And my initial impression is, wow, they don't have anything. And yet, from the very beginning of walking into, a person's home, their entire attitude is, what can we give to you? What of ours will make you feel at home, Clyde? What of ours will make you feel welcomed? And even to the point of acknowledging, hey, we know that you're from a different place and you might feel uncomfortable. So what can we do as your host to make you feel settled in and welcomed and a part of our community? let's give you the most comfortable seat at the table, and
Yeah.
we'll go out and we'll purchase ice, and we'll make sure that your water is cold when you drink it, and just things that might seem little on one surface, but recognizing that for them it is really them going to the extremes that they can to make sure that I'm comfortable.
Mm.
And just seeing that time and time and time again. I mean, throughout the 11 years that I've been there, it is one of the most consistent things is their otherness view. Like they're rarely thinking about themselves. They're thinking about me as their guest. And so
Yeah.
that's just been very challenging for me, because all of a sudden, maybe I walked into that country feeling like, I'm pretty selfless, and I think of others, and basically realizing very quickly, wow, I am very selfish. I am very stingy with the things that I have. I do not want to let go of my comforts very easily, and yet I'm here surrounded by people who have way less than me, and from my perspective, and yet their heart is so much bigger. Their generosity is so much more given freely than I would. And so
Yeah.
it's just that, it's a lot of those small things, just even throughout my day, just again, showing up to work and your coworker has a cookie, and their immediate reaction is break it in half and give you a half of the cookie without even asking.
Right.
It's just like, oh, well, you're here, so you need to be a part of what I'm enjoying.
Yeah.
Let me break off my cookie and give you half of it. So just those things happening all the time, constantly challenging me.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. More others focused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, we've kind of alluded to this in some of our prior conversation here, but we are all broken, and we are all, as image bearers, beautiful. And often I think we can get stuck only seeing the difference, or perhaps the negative aspects of other cultures, or sometimes even our own, if you're living and working in your home culture.
Right.
So what part do you think ethnocentrism subtly plays in the way someone talks about their host culture? And maybe, I guess we could even define the term ethnocentrism, if that's a new word for our listeners.
Yeah. So ethnocentrism is basically looking at another culture through your culture, looking at everything through the perspective of your culture, and therefore judging what you're looking at on the norms, the standards, the expectations of your culture. And so just like a quick example of that would be, your host culture might view time differently than you. And so, you invite a friend to come over to your house, and you say, hey, come over at 3:00. Well, they show up at 3:45 and act as if nothing is off, but you've been sitting there for 45 minutes because you expect them to be there at 3, and you're upset, and you're upset that they don't value your time, and that they lied about coming at 3, and that, all of this stuff. And, really what you're doing is you're looking at the situation from your perspective as a North American, where we value time in the sense of where we value preciseness of time.
Right.
And so that we are judging their actions on that cultural value. Whereas in their culture, relationships are more important than the timing of something. So, whereas they might leave their house with the intention of being at your house at 3, they run into their next door neighbor who they haven't seen in a few days. And it would be incredibly rude of them to just brush them off and say, hey, I've got somewhere else to be. We'll catch up when we come back. That would be so rude in their culture, because you're not valuing the fact that your neighbor is there and you haven't seen them for a few days. And so what they do is they stop and they talk to their neighbor for 45 minutes, because that's what is important for them, is that relational aspect. And then in their mind, they're thinking, my friend who's expecting me at 3 will be fine because we're still going to hang out. And so like the timing part doesn't really, impact. So that's, judging that person's lateness, and I use lateness in air quotes, right? Judging that person's lateness, you're judging them because in your culture that is being rude, but in their culture it is not. And so that's kind of how ethnocentrism kind of really rears its head a little bit, because we were looking at everything from our perspective.
Right. And I imagine it's difficult to filter that out because it's just so intuitive. It's just so innate. Like we don't necessarily wake up in the morning thinking, How is and asking questions, how is my culture influencing the way I'm going about my day? It's just kind of like, that old adage, like the fish doesn't know it's in water. It just thinks that that's its whole world. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can really see how this can be damaging, because a lot of those things you can not realize that you're just kind of bringing your own, cultural assumptions, and it can seem maybe like a moral issue when it's not. It's just a difference of values.
Right. Like he said, like he lied.
Right.
He said it's going to be here. Well, it's not about lying. It's about values.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The statement that we ask people to make when they come over to our new host culture is not, wow, that is wrong, or that is crazy, or that is weird. We say the better statement is, oh, that is different. And then with that statement is a follow-up question of, why is that different? Where are they, how are they thinking? What perspective are they coming from? Because then that keeps you, those other words, weird and crazy and, wrong. Like wrong, we're usually okay at not saying that word wrong. Like, oh, that's just wrong.
Right.
But we do still say like, oh, that's crazy, or that's just, strange. And that's that ethnocentrism really kind of subtly sneaking in the back door, because, even though it may not come, you may not be trying to say it in an overtly negative way, you are pointing out that you think something is off here. Right. And yeah, so just asking like, oh, that's different. That's just different than what I expect. And like you said, Andy, it's we all have this innate perspective, and that's not, we can't dig that out and remove it. And we don't have to be ashamed of that, because we all have it. They have it. I have it. We all have it.
Right.
It's just acknowledging that it's there and making sure that doesn't take over the analytical process in our minds, because when that takes over, that's how you end up being bitter and angry. And this misunderstanding turns into this really deep sense of, oh, I don't belong here and I don't like it here.
Right. Yeah, it kind of poisons you. Yeah, those blinders on, those cultural blinders that don't allow you to see the reality of a situation. Yeah.
Yeah. It's important to remain curious, and it can, when you find yourself living amongst a brand new culture, there's a lot of stimulation. And so I can see how it can be easier to just kind of start making judgments or decisions as opposed to just staying curious, because it takes a lot of energy, emotional and mental energy, to be curious.
It really does.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Heather, I mean, you started off the question with, how does the fact that we know that this host culture is image bearers, just like my culture is, and then how does ethnocentrism kind of come into that? For me, what helps me kind of not get caught up, the overwhelming sense of everything is different and there's just so much going on, is I ask myself, and I guess this is referring back to what I said earlier about how, God's image can be displayed differently in different cultures, is then asking, okay, the thing that is different about this host culture, how is it displaying God's image differently than in my culture? And it helps me kind of hone in that difference in a positive light immediately. And it the story that I just told about how my host culture that I live in, they're so generous and they're so accommodating, and they want to bridge the gap between me and them by going as far as they can. And really, what in the process of asking myself that question about my host culture, how does God's image coming out of that, is I recognized that, that is a beautiful picture of the fact that God went to the ultimate extreme to bridge the gap by coming down in, the person of Jesus. And, talking about the biggest gap, like, I mean, that gap is infinite, and yet he bridged it because he wanted humanity to know, I love you so much. And so I'm going to communicate with you in your way, and I'm going to accommodate your humanity in the sense that I will come as a human. And so for me, I was like, wow, like this is on such big display, like just they're innately displaying that part of God's image. And so that it made me say, wow, like this is amazing. How can I learn from them? Because I'm seeing a different part of God's image in their culture. And so that's kind of how it helps me, not be overwhelmed by everything going around me that is different. I can focus on those things like that.
it's almost like they're modeling this image of God on the Sistine Chapel, like reaching out, extending fully, and it's tempting for us as foreigners, as outsiders, just to kind of lazily
Yeah.
reach back out.
Mm.
Yeah.
You know what really strikes me about that, Clyde, is that as always in conversations around how to, improve the skill of communication or something like that, we're never wanting people to just get the right tools to like say something well. We think that communicating with dignity isn't going to be because you're looking for ways to dignify a culture or like, okay, how can I say this with dignity? It's more kind of what you're saying. The Lord is doing something in your heart. He's showing you real beauty in the image bearers he has in that community. And from that, you're communicating it in dignity because you are being changed from the inside. The distinction I'm trying to make is that we're not just trying to help people become more optimized in their communication by, use poetic words and use words that have dignity and, all these things. It's more like communicating with dignity is not going to come out of necessarily trying to be
a strategy.
Yeah, a strategy. It's going to come from having experiences that dignify other people as image bearers, and that the bearing that has on your own heart and life will come out in the way you communicate about it.
That's good.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So last question for me, Clyde, as we kind of wrap up this topic. It's been rich, but I look at our home culture, and for us, it's North America, and it feels like much of the current strategy around getting people to take action, so whether that's advertising or watching the news or whatever, is focused on fear. It's focused on scarcity, urgency. And so I think it's natural to anticipate that these same strategies might even affect and infect our support raising unintentionally. So how can we tell the stories of brokenness, that faithfully discuss difficult subjects and situations, because those are there, without sort of succumbing to these sensationalist strategies? So essentially, how do we balance dignity with candor?
Just thinking back to a conversation we were having earlier about starting off the story with, this is God's story, right? And God obviously knows that we're broken. That's that's why we have the whole story of the Bible, is that he knows that we're broken. He sees the things that are wrong. And so he can show those to us as well. And we can acknowledge them, and we can say, man, this is broken about where I'm at. This is broken about the host culture. But this is how God is moving in that brokenness. And this is how he has invited us to be part of that repair, part of that redemption that he is writing into that brokenness. And so it's always an acknowledgement of, here's the brokenness combined with, this is how he is moving. This is how he is a loving God who said, I'm not okay with the brokenness. I'm not okay with it just sitting there. And I'm doing things, and I'm inviting my children to be a part of that, and making that the story of, we don't leave the brokenness as at the center of the story. It's just the same way that we don't make us the center of the story. It is neither the brokenness or us that is the center. It's the fact that God is at work. And when he's at work, brokenness can be repaired, and lives can be restored, and despair can turn to hope, and fear can turn to love. And this is the brokenness in me moving through the work that he has given in this certain situation. And just recognizing that, we don't have to, all of those emotions that we see, and, like you mentioned, those strategies, and they're wanting to play on that fear. You'll notice they always leave that emotion lingering. They always leave that emotion as kind of the current that's taking you somewhere, as opposed to, this is why my God is good, because he's not okay with this and he's doing something about it. And I, because of his amazing grace and his love, I've been invited to be a part of it. And you get to be a part of it as well, as my support community. Like, this is, you are a part of him making this this brokenness right. We're in the crowd watching God on stage doing this amazing work. And I'm telling you these stories so that you can really know, you can see what I see. And, I'm moving you from the nosebleed section down to the front row with me so that you get to see this play that God is playing out on the stage in clarity, and you get to watch with me and you get to be amazed with me. So, yeah.
And it's not like look how broken they are.
Yeah.
I think we have to be careful about that. But just like, hey, together, I'm here, you're there. We're addressing brokenness all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Even in our own hearts, right? Like, because I think that the process of fundraising brings out brokenness in every party. So, okay, I know that Andy said that was his last question. And so I do have one that came up for me.
Okay.
So I was reflecting with a colleague, and we were just talking about the importance of communicating with dignity and how sometimes that extends to the stories we tell on others' behalf. And when it's more appropriate to let their story be their story, and when it's appropriate to share that story. And I'm curious because something you just said around, how we're kind of all in the stands and it's all God's story. I can see how, to some extent, talking about how God is at work in the world is just a beautiful thing, and inviting people to behold what he's doing is a beautiful thing. And sometimes, and maybe it just depends on the motivation, sometimes stories can be told, kind of like you said at the beginning, stories can be wielded to try to gain approval or to garner a certain type of response from the audience or something like that. I guess how to help people understand how to use other people's stories and how sometimes a story is somebody's own story to tell.
When you're talking about what God is doing, and perhaps it's a story that is highlighted in the experience of another person, the question that you want to ask yourself is, why do I want to tell this story? Is it to highlight what God is doing? Is it because I want to have this oomph story that really drive home that what I did was worth it and all that? A great place to start when you're kind of approaching this world of sharing, and when it's another person's experience, is to say, what am I trying to highlight? Who am I trying to highlight? And hopefully, the ideal way is that you walk into, if you're working on a team, the ideal way to walk into that experience is for everyone in the team to say, this is not our story. This is God's story. And to be bringing each other into how you see God writing that story through your eyes, and never holding it for yourself and never kind of greedily saying like, oh, this will be my story. It's to say, hey, when I see God doing something amazing, and maybe he's using my interaction with another person, but when God starts to doing something amazing, how can I find ways to bring the community of God into this story from the very beginning, so that on the tail end of things, when it's time to tell stories, it almost feels natural to say, this is God's story that we all got to experience. And he moved one person to the forefront to kind of be the hands or the feet of that story.
Yeah.
But this is how we saw God work in it. So I think that's one of the keys to navigating that, is from the very beginning, before you even experience it, to come together and say, this is what our hope is.
Yeah, that is great. Thank you. All right. So as we wrap up, you have served in Southeast Asia for years, and you've lived on support for the entirety of that time. What would you say to your peers or to future peers striving to raise support? How would you encourage them?
I would first encourage them that all the fear, all the anxiety, all the stress that comes with the reality that your livelihood is dependent on people's generosity, is to not let that crowd out the fact that if God called you to this life, trust that he will provide. And that trust recognizes that you have human feelings in this, and that's okay, but to never let those fears and those anxieties crowd out the fact that the God of the universe has invited you to be a part of an amazing story, and what a blessing that is. And of course, he will provide for you to be a part of that story if he called you there.
Mm.
The second one is just that this relationship that you get to have with this support group really is an opportunity for multiple people to be a part of God's story wherever you're going through your physical presence there, and the blessings that he can bring out in the people's lives who are staying in your home country, right, in your passport country, and aren't going. He will get to bless them by letting them to be a part of something that maybe they could physically never go and do, but they still get to be a part of it from a distance. And it is, again, it's that image of you're all in the theater, and you might be in the front row all the time, but then through your communication with them and through your contact with them, you get to kind of tell them, hey, I've got something special. I want you to sit on the front row with me for this experience, so that you get to see it. And they get to walk away saying, wow, God is doing amazing stuff across the world, and I get to have a part in that. So just like God was inviting you to be a part of his story, he is also inviting them to be a part of the story. And you're kind of this really, unique bridge between how it is all working. And so it's a really unique blessing to be a part of. And so instead of focusing on the fact that, oh my goodness, I've got to raise all this money, it's wow, I get to have this really unique situation where God's blessings are flowing both ways.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, and truly the final question now. We ask all of our guests this question. So you recently received $10,000 and you have been tasked with giving it away. Who do you give it to and why?
I think immediately my heart goes to my community that is support raising right alongside of me, and just and knowing that, man, it would be so great to be to bless them with this out of nowhere gift, right? Because those are always amazing to receive. I've received them personally, and just being able to be on the other side of those gifts. So I think about that. And then I think a lot about of the people in my host culture who sometimes just need a boost financially to really get over some tough humps. And so I think of them as well. And I think of a lot of medical expenses that happen where I live, and medical care is out of reach for the vast majority of people because of financial reasons. So I think a lot about some people in my life that money could really be a huge
game
blessing
changer
medically for them.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Clyde.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you both very much. Blessings on you both.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.